John Wayne comes up behind him and he says, then just shoot him. And he said, there was a long pause, and he said, John Wayne said, you mean I shoot him in the back?
For decades, one story stayed quiet. No shouting, no interviews, no public feud. Just a letter, and a line that cut deep. John Wayne hated one of Clint Eastwood's movies, and he made sure Eastwood knew it. That alone should stop you, because John Wayne didn't complain. He didn't argue in public, and he certainly didn't write letters to younger stars unless something truly bothered him. So what happened? Why did the man who defined the classic Western feel personally offended by Eastwood's film? And why did Eastwood, years later, finally explain the truth behind it? This isn't a story about insults. It's a story about identity, about what the West was supposed to mean, and who had the right to redefine it. John Wayne stood for certainty. Clear heroes, clear villains, honor without irony. Clint Eastwood came from a different place, a colder place, a place shaped by doubt, shadows, and consequences. And when those two visions collided, it wasn't loud, it was surgical. In 1973, Eastwood released his first Western as a director, a strange one, a brutal one, a film that didn't celebrate the frontier, it interrogated it. The townspeople weren't noble, the law wasn't clean, and the hero wasn't really a hero at all. John Wayne watched it, and he was furious. Not because it failed, but because in his eyes, it betrayed something sacred. Years later, Eastwood admitted the letter stunned him. Not because of the criticism, but because of what it revealed. This wasn't about one movie, it was about two generations arguing over the soul of the American West. One built the myth, the other took it apart. So here's the question to keep in mind as we move forward. When a legend tells you that you got it wrong, do you listen? Or do you keep riding in the direction you believe is true? Because Clint Eastwood did answer that question, quietly, deliberately, and it changed Western cinema forever. In 1973, Clint Eastwood took his first serious step behind the camera as a director, choosing to tell a Western story that deliberately moved away from the traditions that had defined the genre for decades. The film was High Plains Drifter, and from its opening moments, it made clear that this would not be a comforting or familiar vision of the American frontier. The story centers on a small desert town burdened by a past it would rather forget. Years earlier, the townspeople had stood by while their marshal was tortured and killed, choosing self-preservation over moral courage. When a mysterious stranger rides in, the town sees an opportunity for protection. But what arrives feels less like a hero and more like a reckoning. Eastwood's character offers no speeches about justice or law. He exposes cowardice, punishes weakness, and refuses to play the role of a traditional Western savior.
There's no need for all that.
All what?
If you want to get acquainted, why don't you just say so?
The tone of the film is cold and unsettling. Violence is presented without romanticism. The townspeople are portrayed as morally compromised, and the idea of frontier honor is largely absent. This approach was intentional. Eastwood was not trying to recreate history or celebrate pioneers. He was using the Western as a symbolic space to explore guilt, silence, and consequences. When John Wayne saw High Plains Drifter, the film troubled him deeply. Wayne had spent his career portraying settlers and lawmen as fundamentally decent people facing difficult circumstances. To him, Westerns were not just entertainment, but cultural statements about courage, responsibility, and national identity. Eastwood's film, in Wayne's eyes, stripped that identity of its dignity. Wayne responded privately. He wrote Eastwood a letter expressing his disappointment and explaining why the film disturbed him. He argued that High Plains Drifter misrepresented the American people who settled the West and suggested that it presented a false and overly cynical view of frontier life. For Wayne, the issue was not filmmaking technique, but moral responsibility. He believed the genre owed respect to the people it depicted. Eastwood later acknowledged that Wayne didn't like the film at all, and he accepted that reaction without resentment. He understood that their disagreement stemmed from fundamentally different views of what Westerns were meant to represent. Eastwood described High Plains Drifter as a fable rather than a realistic portrait, emphasizing that it was never intended as a statement about real settlers or historical accuracy. To Eastwood, the stranger at the center of the film was not a man but an idea, a manifestation of unresolved guilt returning to confront those who had tried to bury it. Wayne, however, saw only a Western that abandoned the values he had worked his entire life to uphold on screen. The conflict was not personal, and it never became public, but it revealed a deep generational divide. Wayne represented an era in which Western heroes embodied clarity, honor, and moral certainty. Eastwood belonged to a later generation shaped by skepticism and disillusionment, where heroes were flawed and justice was often ambiguous. Their disagreement over High Plains Drifter marked a quiet turning point, not just between two actors, but within the genre itself. Rather than a feud, the moment stands as an example of how art evolves and how different generations interpret the same myths in profoundly different ways. High Plains Drifter did not erase the classic Western, but it signaled that the genre was no longer bound to a single vision of heroism. The disagreement between John Wayne and Clint Eastwood was never really about one film. It was about two different ideas of what a Western hero was supposed to be, shaped by two very different eras of American life. John Wayne came of age when the Western was about reassurance. His character stood tall in uncertain landscapes, bringing order where there was chaos. The lines between right and wrong were clear. A man might struggle, but his purpose was never in doubt. Audiences knew who to trust and who to fear, and that clarity mattered in a country emerging from depression, war, and global uncertainty. For Wayne, the Western was a moral compass. It told audiences who they were supposed to be: courageous, principled, willing to stand their ground even when the odds were stacked against them. That belief wasn't an act. It was something Wayne carried personally, both on screen and off. He saw the genre as a way of honoring the past and reinforcing values he believed were worth protecting. Clint Eastwood entered the genre at a very different moment. By the time he became a leading Western figure, America was questioning its institutions, its wars, and its heroes. Certainty had faded. Doubt had taken its place. The Western no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a question. Eastwood's early roles reflected that shift. His characters were quiet, ambiguous, and often morally compromised. They didn't explain themselves. They didn't seek approval. Justice, when it came, felt uneasy rather than triumphant. This wasn't an accident. Eastwood understood that the audience had changed, and he allowed the genre to change with it. When Eastwood later reflected on Wayne's letter, he described the situation as a clash between generations rather than personalities. He acknowledged that Wayne represented an earlier vision of Westerns, one rooted in idealism and clarity, while his own work leaned toward deconstruction. He even admitted that he was intentionally kidding the genre, pushing against its assumptions rather than embracing them. From Eastwood's perspective, Wayne wasn't wrong. He was simply speaking from a different time. The Western Wayne loved had been built to inspire. The Western Eastwood was making was designed to interrogate. One reassured audiences about who they were. The other asked whether those stories still held up under scrutiny. What makes this moment significant is its restraint. Neither man attacked the other publicly. There were no bitter interviews or personal insults. The disagreement stayed private, carried quietly through a letter, and remembered years later with reflection rather than resentment. That restraint speaks volumes about the mutual respect that still existed beneath the disagreement. The genre itself, however, did not remain still. Audiences increasingly gravitated towards stories that acknowledged moral complexity. The clean hero of the past gave way to figures who carried guilt, doubt, and contradiction. This shift didn't erase the classic Western, but it placed it alongside newer interpretations rather than above them. In many ways, Wayne and Eastwood were guarding the same tradition from different angles. One protected its ideals, the other tested its limits. And the tension between those approaches helped shape what the Western would become in the decades that followed. The question left behind is a quiet one, but an important one. When myths are passed from one generation to the next, are they meant to be preserved exactly as they are, or examined honestly as the world changes around them? A few years after High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood made a quiet attempt to bridge the gap. Despite the disagreement, he still admired John Wayne and believed there might be a way for them to work together. Eastwood came across a script titled The Hostiles, a Western built around tension rather than heroics, and he thought it could offer common ground. The story centered on two opposing figures forced into an uneasy alliance: a lawman, an outlaw, each distrustful of the other, each carrying his own version of the past. It wasn't a traditional good versus evil Western, but it wasn't a complete rejection of the genre either. Eastwood saw it as a chance to explore conflict without tearing down the idea of order entirely. He sent the script to Wayne. Wayne read it and declined. Eastwood revised the material and sent it again, hoping the changes might make a difference. The response was even colder. According to accounts that surfaced later, Wayne dismissed the script outright, reportedly tossing it into the ocean and making his feelings unmistakably clear. To him, the problem wasn't execution, it was philosophy. Wayne believed modern westerns had lost their balance. Lawmen were being portrayed as weak or morally compromised. Townspeople were shown as foolish or cowardly. Authority, once a stabilizing force in the genre, had become something to be mocked or undermined. Wayne saw this trend as a mistake, not just creatively, but culturally. For Eastwood, the refusal was disappointing, but not surprising. By that point, he understood that their visions simply did not align. What Eastwood saw as realism and emotional honesty, Wayne saw as erosion. What Eastwood viewed as evolution, Wayne interpreted as disrespect. The moment is important not because of the rejection itself, but because of what it represents. Eastwood wasn't trying to provoke Wayne. He wasn't challenging him publicly or attempting to replace him. He was reaching out, offering collaboration rather than confrontation. Wayne's refusal made it clear that the divide was no longer negotiable. There would be no shared film, no symbolic passing of the torch. The Western would continue forward without merging its old and new guardians. And yet, even in refusal, there was clarity. Wayne knew exactly where he stood, and he did not compromise. Eastwood, in turn, did not retreat. He continued making Westerns that leaned into ambiguity, questioning authority, and exploring the darker corners of human behavior. Films like The Outlaw Josie Wales and later Unforgiven would carry those ideas even further.
They'd catch up to us by the end of the day. Judging by these tracks, there's maybe...
What's striking is what never happened. Eastwood did not lash out. He did not mock Wayne's beliefs. He did not turn the story into a public grievance. Instead, he absorbed the moment and moved on, allowing the work itself to speak. The failed collaboration between Eastwood and Wayne stands as a quiet ending to a larger conversation. It was the final confirmation that the Western, like the country that created it, was no longer speaking with a single voice. Some myths were meant to be protected, others were meant to be examined. And in that space between protection and examination, Clint Eastwood found his path forward. As the years passed, Clint Eastwood never tried to rewrite the story. He didn't soften John Wayne's reaction, and he didn't exaggerate it either. When asked about the letter later in life, Eastwood spoke calmly, without defensiveness, and with a level of respect that surprised many people who expected bitterness. Eastwood acknowledged that Wayne's criticism came from conviction rather than hostility. Wayne believed deeply in what Westerns represented, and when he felt those values were being undermined, he reacted as someone protecting something he loved. Eastwood understood that instinct. In fact, he said he was almost flattered that Wayne cared enough to write to him at all. For Eastwood, the letter was confirmation that Wayne saw him as a serious filmmaker, not just an actor passing through the genre. Wayne didn't ignore the film. He didn't dismiss Eastwood as irrelevant. He engaged with the work, even if he rejected it. That mattered. Eastwood has often said that he never set out to attack the Western or insult the pioneers Wayne admired. His goal was to explore the genre honestly, through the lens of a different time. He believed audiences had changed, and that stories needed to reflect a world that no longer felt simple or certain. Where Wayne sought reassurance, Eastwood sought reflection. What stands out in Eastwood's recollections is the absence of ego. He never claimed his version of the Western was superior. He described it as different, necessary for his moment, but not a replacement for what came before. In his view, Wayne's films and his own could coexist, speaking to different generations without canceling each other out. Eastwood also recognized that Wayne carried the weight of history in a way few actors ever have. Wayne wasn't just a movie star, he was a symbol, and symbols resist change. Eastwood respected that, even as he chose not to follow it. When Eastwood later made Unforgiven, many critics saw it as the final dismantling of the classic Western myth.
You kill a few chickens if you have to, and keep those hogs that got the fever separate. If you have any problem,
Eastwood himself framed it differently. He described the film as a reflection on violence, regret, and aging rather than a rejection of heroism. In some ways, it echoed Wayne's concerns more than people realized, showing the cost of the myths both men had wrestled with. Looking back, Eastwood never framed his disagreement with Wayne as a feud. He described it as an honest difference of belief between two artists shaped by different eras. Wayne had lived through the Great Depression and World War II. Eastwood came of age during cultural upheaval and political doubt. Their westerns reflected those experiences. Eastwood's truth about John Wayne, when it finally emerged, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet and measured. He respected Wayne's stance, even as he refused to adopt it. And in doing so, he demonstrated something Wayne himself valued deeply: standing by one's convictions without needing to tear someone else down. The letter remains what it always was: not a scandal, not a feud, just a moment where two visions of America crossed paths and continued riding in opposite directions. When people look back at the story of Clint Eastwood and John Wayne, it's tempting to frame it as a conflict. Two icons, two egos, two visions colliding. But that framing misses what actually made the moment meaningful. This was never a feud. It was a conversation that never quite happened out loud. John Wayne and Clint Eastwood were not enemies. They were caretakers of the same genre, standing at different points in its life. Wayne inherited the Western when it was young and optimistic, when the country needed reassurance and heroes who stood unshaken in the face of danger.
That's a rattlesnake's warning, Hawk! You squat assassin!
Eastwood inherited it when certainty had faded, when audiences no longer trusted simple answers and wanted stories that acknowledged doubt, guilt, and consequence. Wayne believed the Western should protect a myth, not because it was perfect, but because it gave people something to hold on to. For him, those stories were tied to identity, to national pride, to the idea that hardship could be met with clarity and resolve. Eastwood didn't reject that belief. He simply felt it was incomplete. He saw a genre that could do more than reassure. It could question. It could reflect a world that felt morally complicated and emotionally unresolved. His westerns didn't erase heroism, but they stripped it of comfort. The letter Wayne wrote after High Plains Drifter stands as the clearest expression of that divide. It wasn't angry, it wasn't public, it was personal, and it was honest. Wayne was defending something he believed was being lost. Eastwood, in turn, recognized that truth, even if he didn't agree with the conclusion. What's remarkable is how both men handled the moment. Wayne didn't campaign against Eastwood. He didn't dismiss him as talentless or irresponsible. He simply refused to participate in a version of the Western that no longer aligned with his values. His rejection of the hostile script wasn't petty, it was consistent. Eastwood didn't push back publicly. He didn't frame himself as misunderstood or attacked. He accepted Wayne's position and continued on his own path, allowing his work to speak instead of his ego. That restraint is rare, especially between legends. Over time, history made room for both visions. Wayne's films remain foundational, studied, and celebrated for their craftsmanship and moral clarity. Eastwood's westerns are praised for their introspection and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One did not erase the other. Together, they define the full arc of the genre. In many ways, Eastwood's later films revealed just how deeply Wayne's influence lingered. Unforgiven, often seen as a dismantling of the Western hero, is also a meditation on responsibility, aging, and regret. It doesn't mock the myth, it mourns it. It asks what happens to men who believed in that myth once the world no longer needs it in the same way. That question might be closer to Wayne's concerns than people realize. Eastwood never claimed to replace Wayne. He understood that Wayne represented something unrepeatable, a specific time, a specific need, a specific audience. Eastwood's truth about John Wayne is rooted in that understanding. He respected the man enough not to caricature him, even when their beliefs diverged. And Wayne, for all his resistance to change, respected Eastwood enough to engage with his work seriously. He didn't ignore him. He didn't dismiss him as irrelevant. He cared. And caring in this context mattered. So when Eastwood finally spoke openly about the letter and the disagreement, what emerged wasn't scandal. It was clarity. A recognition that art evolves because people do, and that disagreement doesn't require contempt. The Western didn't die with John Wayne, and it didn't begin with Clint Eastwood. It passed through them, shaped by their hands, altered by their convictions. Each man rode the same trail in a different direction, guided by different landmarks, aiming for different horizons. And maybe that's the most honest ending to this story. Not a winner, not a loser, just two artists standing by what they believed without needing the other to be wrong. So now the question shifts to you. When you watch a Western, what do you look for? Comfort or challenge? Certainty or reflection? Do you find yourself drawn to the clean lines of the past or the uneasy truths of revision? Or do you see value in both, depending on the moment? Because the truth Clint Eastwood finally told about John Wayne isn't about disagreement, it's about respect. About understanding that legends don't have to agree to matter. They just have to stand their ground. And sometimes, the space between those positions is where the most lasting stories are found.